It's great to welcome back to the program today Neil Howe, the acclaimed historian, economist, demographer, and also New York Times bestselling author of The Fourth Turning is Here, as well as over a dozen books on demographic and social change. You know, Neil, last time we spoke, it was 2017, and we talked to you a little bit about where you saw the country and the globe in terms of stage and positioning with regard to these cycles and frameworks of societal change that you've written so much about. I'm curious, how would you assess where the last 6 years since you and I spoke have changed or moved us within this framework?
Well, it's been 6 years since then, 2017 to 2023, and look, I mean, clearly we're further into the fourth turning that Bill and I wrote about, I don't know, 25 years ago, and uh, closer to what we call the ekpyrosis, or the consolidation and climax of this period, which we expect to end in the early 2030s. It's Back then, uh, the geopolitical tensions have risen considerably. I think it's fair to say we have a major land war in Europe. We have a threat of war in the Western Pacific. We now have new threats of war in the Mideast. And I think most worrisomely, and this is where we see the parallel to the 1930s, is the sort of the superpower alignment, right? A realignment of major powers where you can see everyone sort of siding up on one side or the other, pro-Western, anti-Western, if you want to call it that. The other thing we saw back then in 2017, although maybe hints of it were seen in the 2016 election, Clinton against Trump, is the growing specter of partisan conflict within the United States, the growing polarization of red zone and blue zone. Back then, the question of civil war in America was not even on the radar screen. We didn't even ask questions about it. Today, it's routinely asked, and Americans say, about half of them say, we're likely to see something big happening in that regard in the next few years. And also the pessimism of the country with regard to its long-term future has usually increased, right? People are very pessimistic about where America is heading, and of course that furthers their taste for confrontation, maybe in a way that will make it better. Maybe one side needs to win, or maybe we need to put democracy aside for a while. One thing that I've certainly noted is around the world, not just in the United States, but the declining faith that the rising generation has in sort of liberal democracy and due process. There's a growing impatience with that, and you see that in the rise of so many of these charismatic, populist, and somewhat authoritarian and sometimes ethnocentric leaders all over the world. You see it in India, China, the Philippines. You see it in Southern Europe. You see it in Latin America. It's not just here. You know what I mean? It's around the world. And a big point of our book, actually, is that these generational changes have become global. The Great Depression and World War II were global events. And the awakening that we saw by younger generations challenging the strong institutions of their war-winning elders back in the late 60s and 1970s was also global. It was not just in Berkeley University in Columbia, but it was in Paris, it was in Prague, it was in Berlin, it was in Rome, it was in Beijing, it was the Red Guard, the Cultural Revolution against their parents. It was around the world. So we think these patterns, these turnings patterns, are global. They're increasingly global.
What sort of role or importance did what happened about halfway between your last conversation with me and today, January 6, 2021. What sort of a role or importance does that have in your analysis? And if it doesn't, then that's fine too.
Role of what exactly?
In terms of your assessment of where we are in this cycle, you've talked about the combustibility sort of that can take place when there is a lack of a unifying experience within a country. One might argue that January 6th was the exact opposite. It was a fracturing experience in that or any other sense.
Well, a fracturing experience to one side can be unifying for the other. And let's not forget that among the fourth turnings we've experienced in American history, it's sort of Anglo-American history, really going back centuries, is both external conflict and internal conflict. And very often we fight both at the same time. The 1930s, I think, was thought of as an extraordinarily partisan, bitterly divided time for America. With the New Deal. I mean, half of America thought of it as the red decade, and the other half thought of it as the fascist decade. But then, unexpectedly, and for reasons that I outline in the book, the nation was able to unite around World War II and conquering half the world in a fight against global fascism. But that was an extraordinary end that no one would have predicted, right? As late as the very late 1930s. So it remains on a razor edge, right? Which way America goes. But that's certainly one big question that I often get asked.
When there are predictions, as there have been for, 10, 15 years, that along the lines of foreign policy, you had a group of people that in 2015 started saying, if Hillary Clinton is elected, she'll start 3 wars. In the lead up to the election of President Joe Biden in 2020, you had a contingent of folks saying if Joe Biden is elected, he's going to get us into World War III. Analogously, there have been folks predicting a major economic recession or depression from about the same time, or even 2014, 2013. It seems as though if you're always predicting these things, eventually it will happen. And that does not necessarily mean that the predictions at the time that they were made were particularly insightful or interesting. Can you talk a little bit about those who were always predicting the same thing all the time, and then it eventually happens because it's a feature or a part of the way the country is organized or the world is organized? What are we to glean from those sorts of predictions? Are they useful? Are they interesting?
Well, I can't vouch for other people's predictions. I can only talk about my own track record. And when we wrote about this in 1997,
right,
it was sort of late in the Clinton presidency, and we said, look, we have another 7 or 8 or 9 years to go, and what we called the third turning, which is going to be a time of great individualism, market boom. Things were going to be fine. And then we're going to hit this fourth turning, which was going to be a generation long, and it was going to extend through the 2020s. So we didn't always predict there was going to be bad news. We sort of said when it was going to occur and over what time period it would ramp up, it would climax. So I really haven't changed. What we did predict would be a catalytic event sometime in the first decade of the 20th century. We suggested 2005. It turned out to be 2008. I mean, it was the GFC. Mm-hmm. And that was really kind of a huge divide in trends, right? I mean, suddenly global trade was expanding as a share of global product. It's been shrinking ever since. Democracy was expanding around the world. It's been shrinking ever since 2008, right? Technology was supposed to overthrow dictators up until 2008. Ever since then, dictators have embraced technology, the internet, social media. You can whip crowds into a frenzy with it, and you can also surveil your own population perfectly. These are all huge changes in the use of technology and in the social mood and the increasing impatience of younger generations. for a world that is kind of gridlocked and seems sclerotic, particularly the liberal democracies, seeming unable to respond to this, both unable to respond to the changing world and also unable to respond to the aspirations of their own younger citizens or to retool their institutions and make them work properly. Again, for parallels, we see these early fourth turning decades, the most recent of which was, we all know, was the 2030s, although none of us remember them. And of course, that's part of the whole problem of a generational cycle, which takes a lifetime, is that we're always moving into an era that no one alive remembers, right?
What role does something like a pandemic, including the COVID-19 pandemic that took place since you and I last spoke and now, pandemics in general and or COVID specifically, how does that interact or intersect with the 80-year cycle that you talk about?
Well, we know something about pandemics. A lot of research has been done on them, even minor ones. I'm not talking about the Black Death or anything like that, or even the Spanish influenza. Mm-hmm. But we all know they generally tend to be bad for the economy. They tend to raise populist reform. In other words, they tend to radicalize and polarize the public in response, to adjust to the changes that occur in its wake. So they are destabilizing for the economy and society. I think we can safely say, no matter what the era, is one of the reasons why World War I was so badly remembered by America, because as soon as they came home, we had this horrible, influenza, and we had back-to-back recessions. And I think this one was particularly unique because of the extraordinary response of public policy, right? We had this huge stimulus response, which I think in retrospect seems a little bit all out of proportion to the hit to GDP. I mean, most households had huge growth in disposable income that they never would have had in a normal period, absent the pandemic. And as a result, again, I think it's been destabilizing, but mainly due to just the increase in debt. I think increasing indebtedness is one of these huge challenges that the national government faces in the United States. We're up to, over 100% of GDP in net, publicly held federal debt, both at home and around the world. There may be other reasons in the not too distant future we need to run more debt. And if that's the case, we'll either need to find huge means of getting revenue or be cutting some of the expenditures we currently have. And right now, looking at the House and just looking at government, we don't seem to be able to respond very well. So a lot of danger signals, right, going on right now.
Last thing I want to ask you about, and then I'll let you go. At the individual level, are there particular things that individuals can or should be doing in your mind to prepare for this coming part of the cycle? Look,
protect your portfolio. Inflation is always a huge problem in fourth turnings, is particularly a way in which governments get out from under their debt. That's been true of every fourth turning going back centuries, right? That is a familiar technique that sovereigns use to get out from under. It was certainly part of World War II and its aftermath. And I think it will be necessarily again. So that's certain. Maybe people should have taken my advice 3 months ago before bond yields started going up. They would have saved themselves some pain. But my point is that that's characteristic. I think it changes how you want to invest in the S&P in terms of equities, probably looking a little bit more on things like defense and manufacturing and materials in a world in which we're kind of rebuilding the outer world and maybe not focusing so much on experiences. And most of all, I think it's a time for people to renew their ties from their family. Look, we've seen a huge renaissance of multi-generational living during this fourth turning. I mean, everyone's living with their parents and their grandparents. And I think that is in a almost semi-conscious prepping, for a time at which a lot of the guarantees that governments and, both federal and local have provided to people may not be there, right? We may have to depend upon each other more. And look, millennials generally get along well with their parents. I think the personally generations get along well, and I think this will be a strength moving forward. And if people are wondering, in an era of sort of government chaos and maybe a cutting back of generosity because we have other public agendas to attend to, where am I going to turn to for long-term care? Where am I going to turn to for a lot of these things? The lesson of Fourth Turnings is these are eras when we turn to our families.
We've been speaking with historian, economist, and demographer Neil Howe. We will link to his best-selling book. Neil, really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.